because we're right here, as we've already said, we're about to enter into these fall festivals, and we understand these are divine appointments. And that as we're preparing for them, it really makes us focus all of our attention, all of our energy, knowing that we're fixing to go before the King. And we know that when we go before the King at these fall festivals, that we want to be found in the right garments. That we want to be seen as one that's taken the time to prepare themselves, and we come before Him as that bride that's supposed to be without spot and without wrinkle. And it was amazing to me as I began to look at this week's Torah portion, he really begins to break it down of what it is that he's interested in and what it is that he's looking for from this people that's coming before him. And as I began to look at it, I really wasn't comfortable or for sure with the direction that it was going, but Yahweh's so good because you just sang and Chad began to share exactly with what I believe the Father wants you to learn from this week's Torah portion. And David kind of hit the nail on the head too. In fact, if he stayed here much longer, I thought it was going to be in the notes. But this Torah portion, Nitzavim, it really begins to deal and answers a question that really is very important for our day to answer as well. And that question is, what does it mean to walk in covenant? And David just touched on that. Is it how we keep the festivals? Is it how we keep the Sabbath? Is it how we say the name? Is it how we participate? Is it how the calendar that we keep? Or what does it really mean? And this Torah portion, you'll find that Moses begins to break it down. And it was interesting to me because the generation, they spent 40 years supposedly keeping this covenant. They spent 40 years constantly hearing the do's and the don'ts. This is what I expect from you. This is what you're not supposed to do. And here at the very end, the final words of Moshe, what he chooses to expound and explain to them is that for the past 40 years, you've learned the do's and don'ts. You've heard all the terms of the covenant, but you still didn't get it. And he begins to share with them, this generation that's about to go into the land, this is what it means. This was the whole purpose of everything that I've shared with you. This was the whole purpose of the encounter at Sinai and everything that Yahweh's doing with you as a people, bringing you out, raising you up, providing for you, redeeming you. This was the whole purpose. And he begins to expound upon it. And we find Nitzavim, it's translated as meaning standing, and it's taken from Deuteronomy 29:10 to chapter 30, verse 20. It's a short Torah portion. Some of you may be excited about that. That doesn't mean the notes are going to be any shorter, though. But we find that it's part of the official covenant-cutting ceremony with this generation that's been raised up in the wilderness. And he makes some very profound statements that, if we're not careful, we disregard them. But he's reminding the children of Israel that everything that they've been told, everything that they've been admonished to keep, it's not too hard. It's not too difficult. It's not too far off. And he begins to explain to them why it's not too difficult, why it's not a heavy burden. And he lets them know that what this is intended for is that it's a heart issue. And he begins to instruct them that the whole purpose of everything that Yahweh has done, everything that he's sharing with them, is that it's all about the heart. But the interesting thing is that he goes on and he goes ahead and lets them know that, by the way, when you go into the land, you're not going to keep it. You're going to get scattered. You're going to get kicked out because you still don't get it. But there's hope. Because there's going to be a generation that after all this has come to pass, they've been scattered, they'll lose their identity, they'll be out of the land, they'll have been in rebellion and not keeping covenant. But there's going to be a generation that's going to rise up and they're going to repent. Amen. And they're going to understand what it means to keep covenant. And I'm going to gather them. And he even goes on to say that no matter where they've been scattered, no matter how far, no matter whether it seems that they're out of reach and completely forgotten, I'm going to get them. And I'm going to return them to the land, and they're going to keep it with all their heart. And they're going to love him and do what's been expected of them. And it seems as if that maybe, just perhaps, this is a declaration that's fitting our day. Because there's been no other time in history that we've seen a people that have been scattered to the four corners of the earth beginning to wake up, beginning to come back to covenant. And we find that when we look at this Torah portion, he's telling you your story. This prophecy is for our days. And we find that as he begins to expound on this generation that's going to understand this, once again, it seems that it's just as important for you and I today to understand the purpose of the covenant as it was for them then. In other words, there's a lot more to this than just do this and don't do this. Because this generation that was raised up in the wilderness, they did the right things, and they abstained from what they were supposed to, and yet it seems as if they missed something. And so we find then that as we stand here today, the question has to be asked, what does it mean to walk in covenant? What does it mean, as we sang earlier and Chad talked about, to love him from the inside out? Because obviously when you begin to read this Torah portion, he wasn't interested in just the outward appearance of Israel, but it was a heart issue. And he begins to make a statement regarding this covenant cutting process in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. This is a statement that seems to sum up what Israel's being given. The whole purpose, they've been gathered, they're here to enter into covenant, and this is what I'm about to give to you. This is the point that I want you to get. And the statement in this verse in the English says, the secret things belong unto Yahweh or Elohim, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law, or all the words of this Torah. And when you read it in the English, you're really missing the whole point of what he was expounding and sharing to the children of Israel. Because when you begin to look at this in the Hebrew, you'll find that there was a very amazing and interesting analogy that he's showing them. Because the word secret is the word sathar. It's Strong's number 5641, and it means to hide or to conceal, to hide oneself. And it literally is painting the image of one that would cover their face with a veil. In other words, you're not really seeing them clearly. But this word can also refer to guard, to defend, and to protect. And it seems to be connecting the fact that the reason that something's being concealed, something's being hidden, it's for the purpose of protecting it. It's for the purpose of guarding it. It's for the purpose of defending it, lest it somehow be compromised or defiled.
Amen.
Then he makes a statement, but the revealed things belong unto us. The word revealed there is galah, and it means to uncover, to remove, to reveal oneself, but it's especially used of taking the hair away from the ear to whisper the secret things to. It can mean to remove a veil or to make bare the face. And so when you take this back to the Hebrew, he's making this connection that Yahweh, there's these secret things, it's hidden, he's covered with the veil in order to protect and defend the secrets of his character and who he is. But unto you and I, he's removing the veil.
Wow.
He's revealing himself. He's revealing the secret things to those that would walk in covenant. And so it seems then that could the point that's being relayed here and conveyed to Israel and now to us is that he's trying to teach them and get them to understand this is what it means to walk in covenant. That walking in covenant has to do with Yahweh, who's hidden and concealed himself. And we find the reason he's hidden and concealed is that it's dealing with him guarding, defending, protecting his holiness, his character, who he is, lest it be defiled, lest it be contaminated. But now he's choosing to remove that veil and to begin to reveal the secrets of who he is.
Amen.
The secrets of his character, the secrets of his holiness, his very identity is now being poured out and revealed to those that would choose to walk in the intimacy of the covenant with him. And yet we find that to reach this level of covenant, this whole dissertation, all of these laws that have been given to them, it was all to teach them how to properly handle themselves, how to properly handle him, lest they profane that name.
That's right.
In other words, as he begins to reveal the secrets of who he is, it would now be upon you and I. We now become the ones that will guard, that will defend, that will protect his character, his holiness, his identity, who he is. How do we do that? But when he puts his name upon you, what happens is it's just like a husband and wife. You now represent him. His name's now on you. And so we find the whole purpose of all the covenant, of all the commandments that are being given, it was to teach them how to walk holy, because now they would represent his holiness in the earth. Amen? And we find that if we're not walking in holiness, and yet we're proclaiming that we wear his name, and we're hanging our hats on the fact that we're covenant keepers, and we let everyone know that we're covenant keepers, and yet we're not walking out the way we're supposed to, what have we just done? We profaned the name. The secrets that have been revealed, his very identity has now become compromised. And so we find that this generation that he's gathering, the whole purpose he's trying to get across from them, everyone knows, I redeemed you out of Egypt. Everyone knows that it's my name that I've placed upon you. And now, so wherever you go, you now are representing me. And how you conduct yourself and how you handle me is now showing the rest of the entire world who I am, my character. And as we begin to understand this goal, the question then becomes, how do we walk in this level of covenant? Because it's obvious, this generation, they said, I do. All that you said we'll do, we'll keep it. But yet, they really didn't get it. Because 40 years later, Moses is still addressing this issue. And the last words before he leaves the children of Israel is to remind them it's about the heart.
Amen.
It's a heart issue. You've got to get this. You're about to go in the land. You're about to be set up. It's to go into the land and set up the kingdom. But if you don't get this right, then you've got a shaky foundation. It's not going to be built on the right foundation. And as we continue to look, you'll find that in Psalm chapter 25, verse 14, the same statement and concept is being relayed because it tells us that the secret of Yahweh is with them that fear him, and he will show them his covenant. Hallelujah. In other words, there's something about walking and fearing Yahweh that would cause you to know the covenant, to know the secrets. Well, let's look at this term in the Hebrew, because in the English, we've completely removed ourselves from this concept. What does it mean to fear Yahweh? In the Hebrew, it's the term yareh. It's Strong's number 3373, and it has a wide range of meanings. It can mean fear, reverence, respect, and you'll find that it's used several different ways throughout the scriptures. And when you begin to study, it's interesting because the sages teach that there's 3 levels or types of yareh. There's 3 types of fear. And in fact, you see all 3 demonstrated in the scriptures. There's the basic fear of something unpleasant. The second type of fear that they refer to is the fear of breaking the commandments. In other words, the fear that if I do something wrong, I'm going to be punished. And so because I don't want to have to deal with the punishment, I'll be obedient. And yet we find that this type of obedience, what happens is, it doesn't really change the inside, does it?
Nope.
It's an outward show. Because I'm only being obedient because I don't want to have to deal with the consequences. And so we have a yareh of Yahweh, and we're being obedient because we don't want to deal with the consequences, and yet we're not really dealing with the heart. We're not really dealing with the inside of the man. And we find that Yeshua deals very harshly and strictly with the individuals that would have this type of yareh. Because you see it exemplified in the Pharisees. They knew the word. They knew the covenant. They knew all the do's and the don'ts, but they had this type of yareh. It wasn't about the heart. It didn't change the inside of the man. In fact, they were referred to as whitewashed sepulchres. They looked really good on the outside. They wore their seats just right. They had the look. They kept the Sabbath to the T. They had the right calendar. They had it all down, and yet it was dead men's bones inside. Because it was all about the outside and not about the inward man. And finally, we come to the third type of yareh. And it's defined as a profound reverence that comes from rightly seeing. Wow. And I thought, my goodness, that's amazing. In fact, the term yareh is connected. It has the same roots as the term ra'ah, and it means to see. In other words, this final type of yareh, this type of reverence, only comes when you truly see. And when you truly see, now you respond with the type of respect and the reverence that's due. And so we find that what he's trying to reveal, I believe, is that by truly seeing who he is, and when we begin to cultivate a reverence for him that he rightly deserves, and we're walking in covenant, now there's a change that takes place. It's not just a response because I don't want to get in trouble. It's not just an obedience out of fear of being judged, but we find that it becomes a response because a people look and they see the majesty and the honor and the glory and the wonder of their Creator. Hallelujah. And because of that, they yearn to draw close. They yearn to know Him more, and it takes the relationship to a completely different level. Amen? And you'll find that when you have individuals that have that type of yareh, it's a completely different walk, isn't it? Than an individual that's not worried about the inward, but only about the outward. Usually you can pick them out a mile away. The fruit becomes evident. And so as we begin to understand this, we find that once he uncovers and reveals himself, once we truly see who he is, then now it becomes our responsibility to guard, to defend, to protect his character, his majesty, his holiness. Why? Because we now represent him. And so now we find that it's our character that begins to change. It's our heart that begins to change because it's being molded and shaped, and we're wanting to represent him and who he is. And so it seems in that it's only when we cultivate this type of attitude and our desire is to honor him and to render unto him the respect that he deserves, that then we can finally understand what it means to walk in the covenant. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12, a statement is made, and he actually begins to lay this out. And it's as if you're building on this. The foundation, and then the walls, and then the roof. He says, and now Israel, what does Yahweh require of you? But to fear Yahweh, Yahweh thy Elohim, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve Yahweh thy Elohim with all thy heart, and with all thy soul. Notice the order. Yahweh doesn't do anything by accident. The first thing he says of what's expected of his people was to Yahweh, to fear him. In other words, to respect him, to see him properly was the first step. Do you realize that depending on how we Yahweh, depending on how we choose to respect and honor and handle him, that's then going to affect the way we walk in this covenant. It's going to affect the way we love him and those around us, and it's going to affect the way that we serve him and those around us. Because we find that if it's not really a heart issue and it's always about the outward appearance, then that's going to be what our walk is based off of. If it's only about the outward appearance, that's going to be the way we love one another. If it's only about the outward appearance, we'll serve on the outside. And yet we find that if it's Yahweh, if it's a true respect and we're here to honor, to love, we understand who he is and we want to represent him and handle him properly. We want to honor the king, and that becomes the basis of our relationship, then our walk is going to be a little bit different. Because now we understand that everything we do and everything that we are, we're now reflecting him. And we understand that the way we serve and the way we love one another, it all becomes now a picture. You're revealing him to all those around you. Amen. Do you realize that an entire generation had the opportunity to do this, and they missed it? And yet we find that as Moshe begins to share this final speech, he's letting us know that the requirement of when he was going to regather his people, it would have to do with when they finally understood this. And so we fast forward today to the Hebrew Roots community, those that claim that we're covenant keepers. And yet as we begin to look at this, we're finding he's actually admonishing us and letting us know, what does it mean to walk in covenant? Do we truly understand? What's the purpose? What's our goal in this? How are we handling it? And with that, we fast forward to Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 10. And this is the statement that's made at the beginning of this Torah portion, when he's letting them know that you stand here to enter into covenant. And he makes a statement. It says, you stand this day, all of you, before Yahweh your Elohim, your captains of your tribes, your elders, your officers, with all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and thy stranger that is in thy camp, from the hewer of thy wood unto the drawer of thy water, that thou shouldst enter into covenant with Yahweh thy Elohim, and into his oath, which Yahweh thy Elohim maketh with thee this day. I want to look at that word, stand. You stand this day to enter into covenant with the king. The word stand in Hebrew is nitzav, and it means to stand, to take one stand, or to stand upright, but it can also mean to set over something, to establish it. It can mean to be made ready for something. And when you begin to look at some of the other words in the language that are cognates, it begins to help fill this out of what's about to take place with Israel entering into this covenant. It's connected to the term nitzav, but in fact it's spelled the exact same way, and it means the handle of something, the feature by which it's held or grasped, such as the handle of a sword. Now, how many of you realize if you pick up a sword and you don't pick it up by the handle, what's going to happen? You're going to cut yourself. So that can be one of the most powerful, sharpest swords. And yet, if you don't know how to get it by the handle, how much good is it going to do? You're going to hurt yourself, and you're going to hurt a lot of people. It then goes on, it's connected to this other term, nitzavim, and it means strength, toughness, firmness. But get this, it means the ability of something to hold together in order to perform difficult tasks. And so as we look at this, what's being related to Israel, you're gathered here, you're standing before Yahweh to enter into covenant. And as he begins to share this with them, it seems as if that he's trying to relate it. The whole reason I've gathered you here, after 40 years of going over all the laws, all the do's and the don'ts, you're gathered here to finally grasp the point of all that's been shared with you. I shared all the do's and the don'ts. 40 years you've been putting it into practice. And finally, the last thing I really want you to get before you go into land is how to grasp it, how to handle it properly so that you don't injure yourself and those around you. Don't you think that maybe that's an important lesson for us today? We're not that different from the children of Israel, are we? For the past however long we've been in it, we've learned the do's and the don'ts. And finally we find ourselves here at the threshold, and he's reminding us, okay, now that you got all that down, let's really get to the heart of the matter. You need to understand how to handle it properly. Because this covenant, this word, it's not just words on a page, is it? It's his character. It's who he is. So the way we handle this represents him. So if I take this and I'm not handling this properly, it's no different than me not handling his presence properly. It's no different than Nadab and Abihu going in where they didn't belong and mishandling the presence of Yahweh. And so we find they're being set over, Nitzavim, they're being set over and charged with the responsibility of guarding the character and the holiness of Yahweh, because he's about to set his name upon them. And we find the whole reason they've been given this covenant, these words, is because it would be this word that's going to give them the ability and the strength to perform this task that they've been given. This would be their source of strength. This would be what would teach them how to be holy, how to represent him, how to handle him, how to function together as a body, as a nation, as the Kala, as the collective bride. And we find that if they'll keep this as their priority, then the house would hold together. Amen? Now, isn't it funny that the very thing that seems to be what's supposed to hold the house together, to be a source of strength, to be a source of unity, to be the very thing that's going to cause it to be able to accomplish the difficult tasks, to be something that's going to give the house, the body, the strength, the power, the authority that it needs to operate in the earth, that very thing, the Torah, the covenant, is the very thing that seems to be the dividing factor among the house. And we find that even if we remove the branch that says it's done away with, you take them completely out of the mix, and you begin to look at just those that will acknowledge that the covenant, we're supposed to keep it, and we begin to look among that camp, and we begin to look at our own back door, we find that more arguments happen over how we're supposed to keep these terms than anything else. That's right. Well, you just don't keep the Sabbath right because you don't keep it the way I keep it. You don't say the name right because you don't say it the way I say it, so therefore we can't fellowship. We can't be in the same camp. You can't be saved. And we find that it continues to grow, and then we don't even begin to talk about the calendar issues. And so we find that we begin to hang our hats on our doctrines and our translations and what we think it means, and we fail to remember what was the point of the covenant. What was the purpose of him giving these words? You were to guard, to protect, and to represent who he was, his character in the earth. And we find that as we begin to argue and cause division and lose fellowship and cause this to be what we're known for, then what begins to happen is we're actually revealing that we've neglected the role that we were called to do. We're neglecting the role as the one that would guard the holiness of Yahweh, because now we're representing him, but we represent him as an individual that is a house divided. And we find that instead of treasuring the words that he's revealed in the intimate place, the things that he's revealing to his people, this covenant that he's bringing you into, instead now we use it just as a sword that we really haven't handled correctly, and we begin to injure others around us. And so we find that it's interesting because Moshe, the very last thing he's trying to remind them, and as he begins to share, in the end days, this is going to be important again. It's all about understanding what does it mean to walk in covenant. It wasn't about how much you knew. It wasn't about how well you thought you did it, but it was a heart issue. Yahweh was looking at the heart of the man, and if the heart was going to change, and if the heart and the attitude and the mindset was an individual that understood they represented him, and with every fiber of their being, they were guarding the holiness of their king. Amen? Amen. And so as we continue to look at this term, Nitzav, it's interesting to note that this term can also refer to establishing a boundary line. And that's important because we understand the scriptures deal very strictly with an individual that would mess with the boundary lines. In fact, if you move the boundary lines, you invoke a curse upon yourself. And here we find we're talking about this covenant-cutting ceremony that's taking place with this generation that's been raised up in the wilderness. But if we backtrack to the previous generation, the covenant-cutting ceremony that took place at Mount Sinai, boundary lines were established. We find that boundary lines were set up around the mountain. And here we fast forward to the next covenant-cutting ceremony with this generation that's being raised up. And once again, there's a boundary line that's being established. There's a boundary line that's being set up. We have to ask, what's this boundary line regarding? And who has the right to enter beyond the boundary line? Isn't it interesting that the term Hebrew means to cross over? Who has the right to cross over and enter into this boundary? Well, we find he's about to explain who has the right to enter in. Who has the right to have access to this? If we backtrack and look at the Sinai experience, in Exodus 19, verse 21, in fact, the whole chapter 19, he's talking about preparing for them to enter into this covenant. And we find that he admonishes them to set up boundary lines around Sinai, lest the people touch it and they die. It says, "And Yahweh said unto Moshe, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto Yahweh to gaze, and many of them perish." It's interesting, though, because when you read all of chapter 19, it almost seems as if Yahweh or someone's forgetting what's going on. Because you read at the beginning of the chapter, set boundary lines around the mountain. They can't come up. But then you read, he tells them to go down, remind them that they can't come up. But then he makes a statement, but let the priests come up. And it almost seems as if everything's disconnected. Because then Moses responds, wait, they can't come up. There's boundary lines. And so it's confusing. Are they supposed to go up or are they supposed to stay down? Who's supposed to cross the boundary line? And did he forget that he told them they couldn't? But when you begin to look at it in the Hebrew, you'll find what's being relayed here. He tells Moses to go down and to charge the people lest they break through. The word charge is ood. It's Strong's number 5749, and it's translated as meaning to return, to repeat, to do again. And I think it's an indicator that once again there's going to be a covenant cutting ceremony. Once again there's going to be a repetition of this boundary line being established, and you're going to have an opportunity to be one that maybe has access. It can mean to testify, to affirm, but it also means to stand upright. Then we have the term to break through. Go down and charge the people lest they break through. The word break through is charas. It means to tear down, to break down, to overthrow, to destroy, to ruin, to throw down, but it can also indicate to pull down anyone from his station. And so when you see this statement being made, what Moshe was told to tell the children of Israel is that he's reminding the purpose of this boundary line around this mountain is that it's there to bear witness to Israel. It's there to testify that to cross that threshold without being one that was standing upright, to cross that threshold without being an individual that had the right heart, in order to enter into this covenant, they would actually pull down, compromise, or profane the holiness of the king and his station or office by their actions. And so we find that if they cross this boundary line and they're unworthy to cross it, they're actually invoking a curse upon themselves, and they're actually compromising and pulling down the king from his office. And so we find that it's a very important lesson for Israel to understand. Don't cross the boundary line unless you're one that's standing upright. unless you're one that's ready to enter in and become an individual that's going to guard and protect and handle him correctly. Because if we cross the boundary line and we're not an individual that understands how to walk holy and how to handle the king, the proper protocol, we may not make it back out. In the very next verse, we find that the requirements that must be met in order to cross the boundary line are reiterated. He makes his statement that they must sanctify themselves. Go and tell the priests to come up, but they must sanctify themselves. Yet the response sounds as if Moshe is reminding Yahweh that, wait a minute, we're not supposed to go up at all when you read it from the English. In verse 23 it says that Moses said unto Yahweh, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you charged us, saying, set bounds about the mount and sanctify it. Let's look at this word, cannot. In the Hebrew, it's the term yakol, and it means to prevail, to overcome, to endure, to have power, to have the ability or strength, but it can also infer to grasp or understand something, to attain a mastery of it. In other words, Israel at that time was unable to grasp and understand and master the word that they had been given. And because they didn't truly understand the purpose of the covenant that he was trying to reveal to them, they failed to sanctify themselves from the inside out. Wow. We find they changed their garments. They bathed. They're ready 3 days out. On the outside, ready and waiting. But yet we find that the heart, the inside, had failed to understand and master the words that they had been given. And so we find that to cross it, they'd invoke a curse upon themselves and compromise the king. And so now we can begin to understand this is why Moshe answers the way he does. He wasn't reminding Yahweh, wait, you told us we can't come up because there's boundary lines. But he was reminding Yahweh and revealing the response of Israel. They didn't quite get it. If they cross the boundary line, they're not ready. They don't have the right heart. Wow. They're not standing upright. To cross this boundary line is going to profane and compromise the station of the king. In fact, we find the Hebrew reveals that Moses understood what was at stake. In the English, it seems as if Moses says they're to sanctify it, referring to the mountain. And this is why this passage in the English seems really disconnected, because when you read all of Exodus 19, they're never told to sanctify the mountain. And yet here in this verse, it sounds as if Moses is telling Yahweh, you told us to sanctify the mountain, and that's why we can't come up. And yet in the Hebrew, it reads, Aleph Tav et Har, the mountain, Ve Kidashto. It was the Aleph Tav, which represents the Messiah, mountain. You're to sanctify him. So when Moses makes this statement, it's a statement that it's the Aleph Tav, it's the Messiah that was to be sanctified. It was his holiness that was not to be diminished or compromised. And yet he makes a statement that the people cannot, Yakol, the people had failed to grasp the purpose of the covenant. And because of that, because they failed to understand that the whole point of them being given this covenant was to teach them how to sanctify the king, was to teach them how to handle him, how to keep his holiness, even if they were in a fallen, compromised condition. It was to teach them that this was the proper protocol. This was the proper way to approach the king so that his holiness is not diminished or compromised. And yet we find that Moshe relays the message to Yahweh. They didn't get it. They didn't quite get the purpose of the covenant. And now because of that, they're unable to handle him properly. And so we find that the veil's not removed. Israel doesn't really see him. That's right. He doesn't truly reveal himself. In fact, Moshe is the only one. He goes up and he spends time and the veil's removed, and Moshe sees the glory and the honor of the king. And we find that when he comes back down, they tell him he has to put a veil on his face because they're not ready. They can't truly see. They don't understand. As we continue to look at this word Nitzavim, it's interesting that the root on the end of it is the Zadi Beit. It's the same root that's found in the term Sabah, which means to go forth, to wage war, to fight, or to serve. And some people will take that, we'll see right there, it means to fight. So now I have every right to bring a fight into the house, because the very word when I'm standing in covenant, it deals with to fight, to make war. And we really hung our hats on that one. And yet it also means to serve. And in fact, it's interesting because Savah is the same root of the name of the Creator, Yahweh Sabaoth. He's the Lord of hosts. But the interesting thing is that the first time you see this word Savah is in Exodus chapter 38, verse 8. And it's used in a passage that you really wouldn't think that Savah would be used in, to wage war, to fight. It says, and he made the laver of brass, and the foot of it of brass, of the looking glasses of the women assembling Savah, which assembled Savah at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. We have to ask, well, what does this have to do, the brazen laver, what does that have to do with this term Savah? What does that have to do with entering into covenant, with standing here, with being prepared to enter into the presence of the king? Well, the laver was the place where the priests were commanded to cleanse themselves before serving. And we find that in this verse it was made from the looking glasses of the women of Israel, and so that laver literally became a mirror. That every time the priest would go into the tabernacle, before they could go and serve the king and handle his presence and properly minister unto him in the way that he was required to be ministered unto, they had to go to the laver first. And this laver was a mirror. And it was the water that would cleanse any blemishes that they had within them. But we find that this laver, it was a physical demonstration. And for 40 years, the children of Israel have watched that. They've seen the priest go to the laver. They've seen the priests cleanse themselves at the brazen laver. And now finally, as they're standing preparing to enter before the king, they're reminded, you too are going to have to go to the laver. Why? Because the laver represented the water of the word that would cleanse the inside. It wasn't just about the outside, it was about the heart of the matter. And we find that it would be his word that would become a mirror. And as they began to look into the laver, it would begin to expose the areas they needed to deal with. And if they would allow the laver, the waters of the laver to begin to cleanse the heart of the man, then they would be able to properly serve and honor the king. And it would become less of an outside appearance and the works of their flesh and more beginning to produce the fruit of the Spirit.
Wow, good word.
Could it be then that as Israel stands to enter into covenant, the idea that's being conveyed is that when they stand to enter into covenant, what's taking place is they're actually standing before the laver. That as they prepare to walk in covenant with the king, he's taking them and he's placing them directly before the laver. And they're going to look into the mirror of that word. And this is where that term Savah comes in. They're going to have to wage war with their own heart and their own fleshly desires in order to serve him.
Wow.
Because in order to serve the king, it means that they must decrease so that he can increase within them. It means that their own characteristics and their own fleshly desires have to be dealt with so that now they can represent his character. So that now they can represent who he is in the earth. And we find that it has everything to do with them learning to produce the fruit of the Spirit. Love, patience, joy, self-control. Characteristics that, to be honest, don't really come natural to us. And yet we find that when they stood before the laver, it would begin to cleanse and to expose and to wash these areas out. And it would begin to change the very character of the individuals that stood before the laver. And if they would do that, if they would wage that war with their own inward self, that then they would finally understand what it means to walk in Torah, what it means to walk in covenant, because it was all about a changing of the characteristics of the individual. In fact, if you break apart this term Nitzav, it literally tells you what you do when you stand here before the laver. The letter Nun represents the seed, the word. The letter Zadi represents the righteous man. And the Beit represents the house. In other words, they stand there preparing to come into covenant. And the whole concept, the way they would walk into covenant, would be that the seed or the word of the righteous man would have to be inside this house. And we find that if we're claiming to be in covenant, but we're not really putting the seed, the word of the righteous man in, then that's where we fall into that category of an individual that would have dead men's bones on the inside. Whitewashed on the outside, but nothing of sustenance on the inside. Wow. And yet to truly enter into covenant, he's reminding them it's about putting this in and changing from the inside out. And we find that this would be the reason why the house could operate in unity. Why? Because no matter what I think is right or what you think is right, in the end it would be the word of the righteous man. It'd be the words of the covenant that would prevail and be what dictates the direction that we're going. Amen? And yet we find that it's only if we're willing to look into the laver that we'll accomplish this. It's only when we're willing to stand and to begin to wage war with what we think, with what we feel. It's only then when we begin to diminish that then we can truly put the word in and make room for it. And so we find that if we're able to see correctly, yoreh, therefore we can walk it out correctly. Let's look at this term laver. Entering into covenant, they stand before the laver, the place of cleansing, the waters of judgment. The word laver in Hebrew is Strong's number 3595, kior, and it means a pot, a basin, a laver, or a pan. The interesting thing, though, is that in Solomon's temple, there's actually not just one brazen laver, there's 10 lavers. And I thought, what a coincidence. 10 commandments, 10 words, and in the temple, 10 lavers. Just coincidence. Surely there's no connection between the laver and the washing and this covenant and the words we're supposed to be keeping that's supposed to be cleansing us and making us pure. It comes from the root, though, kor, and it means a furnace for smelting, a forge. But the interesting thing is that it can also mean to pierce. In fact, this word kor is used in Psalms chapter 22, verse 16, and it was the verse that was a foreshadow of the Messiah, who would be pierced, his hands and his feet. And so do you think that maybe when he names this the laver, the kior, the place where the judging waters are, that the whole point that he's trying to get across them, that if they'll go and spend time looking into the laver, it's when they look into that laver that they're going to find and see the pierced one. When they look into the word, they would see the one who was pierced on their behalf. They would see the king that they're supposed to be honoring. And so now every time they would come and look into this word, it wouldn't just be about the outward appearance and how to be righteous on their own, but they would see the king. Hallelujah. They would see the one that had been pierced on their behalf, that they could be righteous, and that would cause them to walk out this covenant like it was supposed to be walked out. In fact, this same root, kor, is also used to describe times of affliction. A lot of us have spent some times in the furnace of affliction. And it describes your times of affliction as the furnace of affliction. But it's interesting because Egypt as well was likened. This same word is used to describe Egypt. It says Egypt was likened unto an iron furnace. And I thought, well, what's the difference here? The laver is the brazen laver. It's made of bronze, but he specifically states that Egypt was a furnace of iron. And I thought, well, I need to look at that term iron. What does it mean, the iron furnace? The word iron in Hebrew is barzel, and it means iron, harshness, oppression. It means obstinacy of a people. But the interesting thing is that when you begin to break this word iron down, he begins to reveal to you, this is what they missed while they were in Egypt. How many of you realize that sometimes when we're going through some difficult circumstances and we're going through the furnace of affliction, that sometimes our eyes may miss certain things. Our circumstances become what we look at instead of the pierced one, instead of his word. Yes. And so we find that our vision begins to shift. Well, this word barzel, when you break it down, you have the Beit Resh Zion Lamed. And it's interesting because every single one of these letters forms a two-root stem. Beit Resh forms the word bar, and it means sun in Hebrew. The Resh Zion forms the word secret or mystery. And finally on the end, the Zion Lamed forms the word meaning to despise, to neglect. And so when he makes a statement that Egypt was an iron furnace, the statement that was being made in that Hebrew word barzel was that it was in the furnace of affliction, Israel despised and neglected the secret mysteries of the pierced sun. Wow. In other words, they weren't able to see him in the midst of what they were going through because their circumstances were so big. Because their circumstances were so oppressing. And they put all of their focus and all of their time and all of their energy into the circumstances and the issues and the problems they were having. And they only had time to complain and to murmur and to grumble. They didn't have time to walk away and hear the secrets being revealed to them. They didn't have time to represent who he was because their circumstances. And so we find that it was during the time when they're going through the midst of all this that it becomes likened unto a furnace of affliction because they missed the divine appointment. They missed their opportunity to Nitzav, to stand at the boundary line in order to see the king and prove in the midst of the trying times that they were capable of handling his word, that they were capable of handling his covenant and his character correctly. Let me ask you a question. How many times when we're going through the times of furnace, the trying times, do we miss seeing the fourth man in the fire? How many times do we miss seeing the pierced one and fail to handle and represent his character correctly? Because we find that when whatever labor you're looking into, whether it's the iron labor of your affliction, or whether it's the labor of his word, whatever mirror you're looking into, whatever you've set your sights on, it's going to begin to form and to shape your character. It begins to form and shape what you look like. And so if all of our time and all of our attention is on our affliction and our issues and our problems, then that begins to shape our character, doesn't it? And so we find instead of looking into the labor of his word that would shape our character and prove to him that we're capable of representing him no matter what's going on around us, because his word doesn't change, it's not affected by our circumstances, but instead we choose to be shaped and molded into the things that we're going through. Our circumstances dictate how we respond. And so we find that instead of producing good fruit, the fruit that represents him, we begin to produce fruit based after our flesh and our feelings and our circumstances. And so we find the whole purpose here, the whole reason Israel's been brought here is because they missed this. And he's trying to relay this to them. You're about to go into the land. There's giants in the land, and you're going to have to go and fight for your inheritance. And you're going to have to go and fight and work to set up the kingdom that I'm trying to give you. But your circumstances are going to have an opportunity to shape and mold you. If you're not careful, you'll miss seeing the individual that you're supposed to be representing, and it's your circumstances that will begin to dictate to you.
Wow.
In fact, we see the prior generation, this was the whole problem. They make the statement that there's giants in the land. The land will eat you up and spit you out. We can't take it. We're not big enough. We're not strong enough. And because they took their eyes off the one they were supposed to be looking at, it changed the character of the individuals. And so we find that here, as this generation is preparing to go in, he's reminding them, make sure you keep your eyes in the laver. Make sure you're looking in the right mirror. Make sure you remember that everything you do, you're representing the one that's placed his name on you. And he is bigger than any circumstances. Yeah. Amen? In fact, Isaiah chapter 48, with this understanding, when you go back and read this chapter, you'll find that it completely revolutionizes what you take away from it. In fact, I would urge you to go and read the whole chapter because it deals with this very subject in length. But we're going to focus on verse 10. He makes a statement, behold, I have refined you, talking about being in the laver, the furnace, but not with silver. I have chosen you in the furnace, in the core of affliction. And then he begins to explain to you why he does it. For my own sake, even for my own sake will I do it, for how should my name be polluted? And I will not give my glory unto another. In other words, amen? In other words, no matter what you may be going through, he's going to choose you out of that furnace of affliction because he's already stated and proclaimed that he's put his name on this people. And as long as this people are downtrodden and not rising up to the standard they're supposed to be doing, it's his name that's being polluted. That's right. And so the very thing that Moshe is trying to reveal to the children of Israel is, you've got to get this. If you get nothing else, get this before you go into the land. It's about the heart of the man. You now represent him. And whatever you do, if you mishandle your character, your integrity, you're polluting his name. And he's not going to allow his name to be polluted. In fact, we see this statement made throughout the Exodus journey. Moshe often has to put Yahweh in remembrance when he's ready to smoke the people and completely start over. Remember, it's for your name's sake. Yes. Because whatever happens to Israel, everyone around knows that that's your people. Everyone around knows that's who you've placed your name on. They represent you. And so we find this statement being made that he's going to redeem them, refine them, and bring them out. Why? Because it's about his name. Yes. You represent him. Now, it's no accident that this portion falls directly before the first fall festival of Yom Teruah, the 7th month festivals. It's interesting because currently this month is known as Tishri on the current calendar, yet in the scriptures in 1 Kings you find the 7th month referred to as Ethanim. And Ethanim is translated as meaning enduring, but it's used especially of water, a perennial stream that's constantly flowing. In other words, the name of this month is the month of the flowing waters. Isn't that interesting? In other words, it's the month where you're looking in the laver. It's the month where you're standing before the cleansing waters of his word, that you're looking into this and preparing for these festivals. It's no accident that these festivals that take place during the month of the flowing waters are the festivals that depict the coronation of the king and the king on his throne. We find that the spring festivals deal with the Messiah being the suffering servant. It's all about him redeeming the price that's paid for you. But when you fast forward to the fall festivals, there's been a change. It's no longer the lamb, but it's dealing with the lion now. It's now dealing with him as the king. And we find it's the king that's being crowned at the Feast of Trumpets. It's the king that's sitting on his throne at Yom Kippur and judging the nation. Do you think that maybe, just maybe, there's a connection between being willing to look into the laver, into the waters, into his word, and allow it to be what sanctifies and instructs us on how to properly handle him, on the proper protocol of how to represent who he is and his name, and doing that and being able to actually celebrate these festivals? Do you think that just maybe if we're not spending the time learning the proper protocol leading up to these fall festivals, that maybe we won't be able to really enter in? We won't be able to really see him because we didn't understand and rehearse the protocol required to come before the king. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 24, he begins to talk about this first festival, the Feast of Trumpets. It says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath, a memorial, a blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation." Let's look at that word, memorial. It's Strong's number 2146, zikron, and it's translated as meaning a memorial, a reminder, or remembrance. But it comes from the root zakar, and it means to remember, to call to mind, to bring attention to something, to acknowledge it. But the interesting thing is this term zakar is focusing on information that's readily available, something that you're familiar with, something that you're intimate with. In other words, it's not dredging up a long-lost memory, way deep down there, but it's remembering and calling to mind something that you're very familiar with, something that you've been intimate with, something that you know. And then the word blowing. It's a memorial of blowing. The word blowing in Hebrew is teruah. It's Strong's number 8643, and it's translated as an alarm, a signal, a shout, or a blast. But when you begin to trace the roots, it's interesting because the two-letter root of this word forms the term meaning friend, companion. It refers to one that you're in covenant with. In other words, when he tells you this is a memorial of blowing, this is the first of the 7th month festivals, this is all about the king being crowned, that what he's revealing to you is that on Yom Teruah, it's about calling to mind, bringing to the attention, or acknowledging who it is that you're walking in covenant with. Wow. And yet we find that you're only going to be able to call to mind, to acknowledge and bring to the attention the one that you're in covenant with, if you're familiar and intimate with that individual. In other words, if for the other months and days throughout the year you've had amnesia and you really haven't been familiar and looking into the laver to see the pierced one, if you haven't really been spending the time learning how to handle him, how to properly approach the king, and you wait all the way till the day before trumpets to try and call up anything that you might think you know about how to properly come before the king, you've missed the point. Zikron is dealing with something that you're intimate and familiar with, declaring who it is that you're in covenant with. In other words, he's letting you know that if we haven't spent the time cultivating this relationship, walking this covenant out and sanctifying ourselves so that we're able to stand before him as he reveals his secrets of who he is, then we really won't have a proper shout for Yom Teruah.
Come on.
Because those that would shout on Yom Teruah would be the same individuals that knew how to handle him, that knew how to properly come before the king. Those will be the ones that are involved in the coronation of the king. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 11, in this Torah portion, as he begins to sum up what it is, the whole purpose they're entering into this, and the whole point of everything that they've been given, he makes a statement, "For this commandment which I command you this day, it is not hidden from you, neither is it far off." And as I began to look at that term hidden, it was quite interesting because in Hebrew the statement is lo nifal laet. It's supposedly from the root palan. It means wondrous. It's not so wondrous so that you can't do it, but it's interesting because when you look at the way it's spelled, the nun pei lamed aleph tav. The nun pei lamed forms the root stem, which means to cause to fall, to attack something, to cast it down. It's then connected to the aleph tav, which represents the Messiah. In other words, the statement that Moshe was making to the children of Israel was that the Torah, the commandments, weren't given in order for you to mishandle them. They weren't given in order for you to mishandle them, and therefore by mishandling them actually cast down the aleph tav, actually diminish the king, actually misrepresent who he is and his holiness. So we find that as he's beginning to sum this up, he's reminding them that the focus of this entire dissertation was that they were about to have the individual revealed to them. That they were about to handle the king of all of creation. And the whole purpose of everything that they've been taught was to understand how to properly handle him, how to properly see him. And so we find that as he begins to sum up the purpose of the Torah, he's reminding them it's not for you to cast him down and diminish who he is, but it's about you learning to represent him. And as we get ready to close, I wanted to close with the verse in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 13. He makes this statement. It says, "And you shall seek me and find me." But he adds a clause to this, that those that will seek and find them, he says, "You'll find me when you shall search for me with all your heart." In other words, Israel at Sinai, they really didn't see. Israel, before they crossed into the promised land, they're still not quite grasping it. And yet Moses goes ahead and tells them there's going to be a generation at the very end that's going to be raised up. And the covenant's going to be restored. And we find that it would be this generation that would finally learn to seek for him with all their heart. It wouldn't be about an outward obedience. It wouldn't be about how smart they were, how they looked, or how holy they were, but it would be an individual, a group of people that understood it was about changing the heart. It was about being changed from the inside out and understanding they now represent who he is. And because they understand that everything they do represents him, it would change their character. And they would become a group of individuals that were able to guard, to protect, and to properly reveal his presence in the earth. Can you say amen? Amen. Shabbat shalom.